In 1971, a plane traveling from Uruguay to Chile crashed in the Andes Mountain. There was about 40 people on the plane. The crash was pretty severe, but fortunately, after initial impact, not very many people died. And what followed was a long period, I think it was 72 days, a long period of time in which the individuals on this plane crash, including there was about 20 of these individuals were part of a rugby team. In that span, in those 72 days, the individuals who had survived had to find a way to survive until rescue efforts could find them. And eventually, after I think it was 72 days, rescue efforts were able to be successful. And even though there were about 40 people initially on the plane, there were only 16 survivors. Fortunately, it was considered a miracle that those 16 were even able to survive. But everybody was very, very happy that it had happened, very happy that at least 16 people were able to survive. And after initially interviewing the individuals who were part of this plane crash, they asked them, "How did you survive?" And they said, "Well, we had to eat whatever we could. We tried eating some food that was left over on the plane. We had to ration that out, and then over time, we had to resort to eating the wild food around us." What the survivors did not share with the people who questioned them was that they also had to resort to cannibalism to survive. They decided to begin eating the corpses of those who had passed away rather than killing them. They didn't kill them, but some of these individuals who initially were survivors and then eventually died within those 72 days, they were able to survive by eating their bodies. The survivors didn't disclose this to the people interviewing them, and they decided, well, listen, let's disclose this personally and privately to our individual families, but let's not talk about this publicly. Eventually, the news broke that they did have to resort to cannibalism and that they were eating the bodies of people who had died there. And initially, there was a huge backlash against them. I hope that many of you think that cannibalism is wrong, but I want you to ask yourself, why is cannibalism wrong? And I'm not going to give you an answer. I just want you to have that answer in your mind. Why is cannibalism wrong? If you believe that cannibalism is wrong, you believe that action, the act of eating another human being dead or alive, is wrong. Eventually, though, as time passed on, the public sort of warmed to the survivors of this plane crash, and maybe not warmed to them, but at least felt a little bit more empathy towards them. And there's a couple of explanatory reasons. One, they claimed that they had made a pact with the people who all of the survivors made a pact with each other. If I die between now and the time we rescue, I permit you to eat my body for your survival. So they made that pact. And two, people claimed not only was this self-sacrificial, but again, Chile and Uruguay, very Catholic countries, especially at the time, 1971, the survivors compared it to Christ offering his body at the Last Supper. They compared it to the Eucharist. They said, listen, we didn't eat them because we were hungry. We ate them only because they sacrificed themselves for us. They said, listen, we're going to die. We want you to survive off of our bodies. Now, here's the thing. The act of cannibalism is morally wrong. Generally speaking, you probably believe that cannibalism is morally wrong. do you blame these individuals who were on this plane, who were trying to survive? They got everything, they got all their boxes checked. They were able to get consent. They were able to wait until these people died naturally, or at least, their death wasn't forced upon them. They tried to make sure that eating the bodies was the very last resort. They were eating everything else that they could besides those bodies. And they didn't do it with any bad intentions. But again, the act of cannibalism is bad. Was that whole moral act, that whole situation, was that morally wrong? Now, Kant, I would assume, is going to say absolutely yes, that's morally wrong, because the act of eating another human being is treating that human being as a means to an end rather than an end itself. There's a reason why we pay respect to people's bodies, why we have funerals, why we don't just throw a dead body into the trash and wait for the garbage man to collect it. Because there's something special about a human body, even when that person is no longer alive. There's at least some sort of significance that we place on the human body. And so the fact that these individuals are dead doesn't take away from the severity of cannibalism. So Kant would say, yeah, that's very, very bad. But when you look at the situation as a whole, it gets really tricky, because now you're starting to think of the consequence. Yeah, it was bad, but listen, their intent was good. There was consent there. The people offered this as a sacrifice, and the consequence was good. Most importantly, the consequence was good. It led to their survival, and they were able to live long after this plane crash. This is where morality starts getting iffy. And this is where it becomes a lot less easy to answer whether something is morally good or morally bad, is when we start to take consequence into consideration. We never had to do that with Kant, or we haven't done that yet because Kant never cared about consequence. Aristotle didn't really have a clear image of the moral act in general. Relativism doesn't believe that there is a moral act in the first place. But now that we're starting to think about consequences, it's getting a little bit easier for us, or actually it's getting a little bit more difficult for us to determine whether something is morally right or morally wrong. And so today's note sheet is going to be focusing on this moral system that focuses primarily, and in some cases completely, on the consequence. This is called utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism, it has its merits, and there's a reason why it's really popular, especially in modern times, is because as humans, we're very, we focus on our products, we focus on our achievements, we focus on the ends. We have our minds on the end of all things, and included in that category are consequences. Now, consequentialism and utilitarianism, it's kind of antithetical, and it kind of goes against standard Christian thought. So utilitarianism was never going to work under a Christianity-dominated society. And when did Christianity start losing its power? In the Enlightenment. And so we can look at an Enlightenment figure for the beginning of utilitarianism. So the school itself, the school of philosophy, was created by an Enlightenment philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham, even though he created it, he didn't have a clear idea of what utilitarianism really was. And it wasn't until later on we have another philosopher much more famous. And if you study history in college, if you take a history class in college, chances are you're gonna study this guy, a philosopher by the name of John Stuart Mill in the 1800s. He's the guy who says, all right, Jeremy Bentham was talking about all this stuff. Let's take that and let's make it precise. Let's codify it, and let's make something a little bit more clear to study. And eventually that's where we get utilitarianism, and that word comes from the philosopher John Stuart Mill. Again, this is all happening at the time where Christianity is losing or has already lost its grip on Western thought, at least generally. Now, utilitarianism is very different from Kantianism, but there's something that both have in common. They want to take out of consideration this idea that morality comes from God and it's dictated by God. And they want to focus primarily and specifically on those things that are knowable to us only through our own rationality. And so utilitarianism, like Kantianism, is based solely in reason. It doesn't rely on any divine revelation. It doesn't rely on any unquestionable authority. All you have to do is look at yourself and say, well, hey, wait a minute, this makes sense. I'm going to follow this line of thinking. What's funny, though, is that Kantianism follows that same logic, and you get very different results. So I implore you and I encourage you to follow your own reasoning. Don't listen to somebody who just claims to have authority. But at the same time, be aware that your own thinking and your own rationality is going to take you in a whole bunch of different possible avenues. Now, it's very clear that utilitarianism is popular among young people, and I think I came to the realization that the reason why it's so popular is that it's so easy to understand. And I'm not downplaying people who are utilitarian. Sometimes the things that make the most sense are most right. You don't have to overcomplicate your line of thinking. Sometimes some things are just based in common sense, and utilitarianism is common sense. If I do something and it's going to lead to a bad outcome, I don't do that thing. If I do something and it leads to a good outcome, I'm going to do that thing. That's common sense. It's very easy to understand. And so a lot of people have adopted utilitarianism as their personal ethical framework. Now, we've talked about utilitarianism before, and I realized that I never explained it clearly. Now, if you're listening to this thoughtfully and carefully, I'm going to explain to you as clearly as I can what utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism is determining what is good and bad, and it defines something to be good or bad, or better or worse, on whether or not the consequences of the actions are good or bad, or better or worse. Now, there's a few different ways for you to determine a utilitarian state of mind. A couple of things that utilitarians tend to say, first and foremost, the most common is, I want the greatest amount of good, the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. That's my priority. They're going to use that phraseology a lot. Utilitarians often make the claim that they believe that the ends justify the means. What that means is whatever you do now, as long as it affects the end result as a good, it's a good action. And if it affects it in a negative way, then the present action is a bad thing. Clearly, this totally contradicts Immanuel Kant. Because if you recall, Immanuel Kant, all of his focus is on intention and action, primarily on action. He does not care about consequence at all. And utilitarianism say, well, action is just what happens. There's no real morality attached to it. Your intention may matter, but really it just depends on what the consequence is. So we're going to look at John Stuart Mill's breakdown of utilitarianism to try to understand it. And then we can start comparing that to Kantianism Aristotelianism and relativism. So there's a couple of basic tenets, basic things that utilitarianism follows, that Mill sets out to codify utilitarianism. And the first is what he calls the principle of utility. If you're thinking about utility, you probably know that word. It's a pretty simple English word, but you probably don't use it very often. When you hear the principle of utility, what you should be thinking of the principle of greatest happiness, or the greatest happiness principle. That's really what Mill is focusing on here. He wants to find the greatest happiness. So when you're making a moral choice, whichever choice leads you to the greatest amount of happiness, that's bound to be the moral choice, because happiness is a good, and therefore it's a good consequence. And morality is based on goodness, right? I mean, that's the whole point of this class, is trying to determine good versus bad. So if an action leads to the greatest amount of happiness, that's the best avenue for you to pursue. That's what you should be doing. Even if you don't like that line of reasoning for yourself, you can't argue that we don't use that on a societal level. Think of laws. Laws have to be based on the greatest amount of good. Laws, at least in a fair and just society, cannot benefit a slim minority. It has to benefit the majority. Most countries in the world today are democratic, and this is the whole basis of democracy. If 51% of people are voting for something, that's where you go, because that's the greatest amount. That's the greatest amount of people. 51% of people who are happy is better than 49% of people who are happy. So democracy is based in utilitarianism. It's based on this greatest happiness principle. And then in cases of war, generals and commanders seem to find utility to be the safest option. In times of war, you don't have the opportunity to say to yourself, well, even though, ISIS is trying to kill us right now, it's morally wrong to shoot a gun, or it's morally wrong to hurt someone, so I'm not going to do it. You're not doing a service to yourself, and you're definitely not doing a service to the country and the ideals that you're defending if you have that mentality. Sometimes it requires being utilitarianism to make decisions for a large amount of people. So here's a clear example of this. During World War II, the year was 1940, Winston Churchill and England being at war, Great Britain being at war with Nazi Germany, I think there have been movies that have talked about this instance, but England, or Great Britain, had a process of breaking the codes that Nazi Germany was using at the time to communicate, airstrikes and, their movements and what have you. And the United Kingdom, Great Britain, was able to break Nazi Germany's code in the year 1940. Winston Churchill, who was leading Great Britain, was ecstatic that they had the ability to break Nazi Germany's code, and they could now see what their movement was, what their plans were. But that led Winston Churchill to a dilemma. Nazi Germany had a plan to launch an air attack on the city of Coventry, and it was going to happen very soon. Now, if Winston Churchill were to warn the citizens of Coventry that this was going to happen, then the Nazis would find out about that, and they would realize that their code has been broken, and they would find another way to communicate. But if Winston Churchill allows this one attack to happen on this one town, this one city in England, then what that means is that they don't have to worry about Germany changing their code system, because Germany would not be aware that England or Great Britain had broken that code. And so Winston Churchill made a very difficult decision, but decided ultimately not to warn the people of Coventry that this air attack was going to happen. The Nazis attacked Coventry. Over 400 people died. Thousands of people were injured, homeless. That's a huge amount of casualties. But Nazi Germany continued to use that code, and Great Britain was able to continue to keep an eye on where they were moving and where they were going. History has told us that England, Great Britain won the war, Nazis were defeated. So the consequences were good, but the action was allowing 400 people to die. Was winning the war worth 400 lives? Anybody who's anybody would say absolutely yes. But could you have that on your conscience? The death of 400 people, and mind you, maybe there's the possibility that far more people would have died had he not done this. Still, Winston Churchill gave authorization to the killing of 400 of his own citizens. Not to blame Winston Churchill, but man, that is a tough thing to not only weigh on your conscience, but also that's a tough decision to make, and I don't know what decision I would make if I were in that situation. So in these cases, we have to look at, the bigger picture, or at least that's what a consequentialist or a utilitarian would say. But the problem here, or at least what Kant would see as a problem here, is that, again, it's treating those 400 individuals as means to an end rather than an end of it in and of themselves, and therefore it breaks the second formula of the categorical imperative, and therefore it's an immoral action on Winston Churchill's part. That's what Kant would say. But again, utilitarians would say it was morally illicit. And historians and probably most people would say, yeah, well, Churchill was at least justified in doing that, in allowing those 400 people to die in order to keep their knowledge of Nazi code. So the second basic tenet of utilitarianism is one that I've mentioned often, and it's one that I think is important to know because you all are inundated and bombarded with social media and celebrities, or at least influencers, who live a life of hedonism. And hedonism is what attracts you to certain things. So when you're watching a commercial, or when you're seeing an advertisement, or you're scrolling through somebody's Instagram page, they're utilizing their life as so they're living a hedonistic life. And so I'll explain what hedonism is in a second, but what they're doing is they're living a hedonistic life. And the fact that they're living a hedonistic life, and they're saying you can do this too if you buy this, or if you do this, if you go traveling around the world, if you live in a big mansion, if you're around the right people, if you wear the right clothes. That's what attracts you towards happiness, which is why we've conflated happiness, or at least consumerism, with happiness. Consumerism is probably, I know I sound like a nut job saying this, but I would say consumerism is the biggest religion in the world today. We worship our material goods. It's what's most valuable to us. There's a really interesting series of videos on YouTube that I started watching, and I started watching it because it's mostly NBA players that they have doing this, and it's through GQ. And GQ brings in celebrities. I've really only seen the NBA players, but they bring in celebrities and they say, tell us 10 things you can't live without. Bring into our offices, we'll do a video, you bring in the 10 things that you can't live without. and we'll do a video on it. It's a really interesting and a fascinating way to look at the lives of celebrities. And I have to admit, every once in a while I'll watch one of these videos and I'll say, man, that one thing that they're pointing out, the one thing that they said they can't live without, is a really cool object or a really cool item. My life would be a lot better with it. I kind of want that. There is this one video where Devin Booker, he's a famous basketball player, plays for the Phoenix Suns, really good player. Now most of them, there's really expensive stuff like phones and, designer bags and things like that. But apparently there's a really big wine subculture in the NBA. Like all these NBA players love wine. And so what Devin Booker did was he brought these little circular cards that he picked up when he was in Napa Valley, when he was vacationing there. And what you do is you twist it into a wine bottle, and it allows the wine bottle to flow. It aerates the wine as it flows out of the bottle. And it's just like these flimsy little cards that are probably worth like $1 or $2. But I was like, oh man, that's really cool. I would love to have one of those. So even me, someone who's recognizing these videos as an interesting thing to look at when it comes to hedonism and materialism and consumerism, even I am under the effects of it. But going back to these videos, almost every single one of these videos are about an individual these individuals have these very expensive tastes and it's very consumerist. Very rarely do they have something sentimental. Very rarely do they bring something in that's, making them a better person. Really, it's literally something that they can't live without, like a phone or a laptop or, Air Jordans or something like that, And it opens my eyes to the realization that, we put these individuals on a pedestal because they're important individuals to society. And we look at their lifestyles and we say, I want to be like that. Well, their lifestyles are only possible through money and sometimes through fame. And that requires you spending a lot of money and living this life based in material goods and consumerism. And there's something really missing about that, but this is essentially what hedonism is. I look at them and, yeah, they got really cool stuff and they look really happy. So I'm going to equate owning these really cool things and living these really great lifestyles with happiness. When we're looking at hedonism, so this second basic tenet of utilitarianism, first I want to look at Mill's definition of happiness. So Mill says that happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. That sounds really nice, and I think nobody could disagree with that definition of happiness at a very base level. That's exactly what we strive for on a day-to-day basis. I don't want to be in pain. I do want to experience pleasure, so I want to intend pleasure, and I want to minimize or completely eradicate pain. Now, that goes completely against, even though that sounds agreeable, it goes completely against Aristotle's idea of happiness, this happiness as a telos, because according to Aristotle, happiness is virtue, which you don't get through material goods. You don't get through pleasure. You only get through a virtuous and a rational life. But despite the fact that Mill completely disagrees with Aristotle on this, he goes further and he says that this type of happiness, this one that's based in pleasure and it's the absence of pain, it's the only thing that you, me, anybody else, that any of us desire. It's the only thing we want in life. If something brings us pain, we try to eradicate it. If something brings us pleasure, we pursue that. It's the only thing we really care about. Everything else in the world is just us working towards that. It's working towards that happiness. And so if you're living a life where you desire pleasure at all times, and where you're pursuing pleasures at all times, and you're avoiding pain as often as possible and at all costs, that is hedonism. It's its own school of philosophy, but that is what hedonism is. And it's one that, even if we don't want to admit, often we find ourselves falling into pursuing. I would love to have billions of dollars and to spend it on nice things. Someone who teaches ethics probably shouldn't be saying that, and somebody who teaches ethics certainly should not want to be feeling that, but I can't help but feel that. Good things in life come at a cost, and usually that cost is money. So hedonism, if it's not the natural way of the world, it's definitely, I would say that is concupiscence. It's that desire away from where you should be going. But to be fair to Mill, so again, I clearly disagree with Mill on everything here, but I want to be fair, and I want to paint utilitarianism in a very fair light. So to be fair for him, Mill, at least in this context, he recognizes that pleasure is a broad concept. You don't just get pleasure from being rich and famous and wearing designer clothes and eating super fancy food. You can get pleasure from virtuous things as well. So he says you can get pleasure from reading a book. You can get it from eating an expensive steak. You can get it from using heroin. Pleasure is a broad concept, and pleasure comes from both virtuous and non-virtuous things. But Mill is going to say that someone who experiences every single pleasure in the world, all the pleasure of the world, he would then desire the only pleasures that matter. And Mill says this is the highest pleasures. So what does this mean? Well, as good as material pleasure is, the highest pleasures are those things that are ultimately virtuous, clearly virtuous. So the examples that he gives are helping others in need, pursuing the truth, or creating a work of art. These are the highest pleasures. So what I want you to do, you can't follow the slide here. So I want you to just write that in if you're following along with your notes. There's that long line in the notes. Fill it in with those three things. And these are just three examples, three of many, but helping others in need, pursuing the truth, or creating a work of art, period. So once you have that line filled out, then we can move on. But so again, this is me being fair to Mill. He doesn't think that, using heroin and helping your neighbor is going to give you the same pleasure. He believes that helping the neighbor is a good pleasure, and heroin is a lesser pleasure. I don't know if he would say it's a bad pleasure, but it's at least a lesser pleasure. And if you've experienced heroin and you've experienced helping your neighbor, you would say, well, I've experienced heroin, but I think helping my neighbor is a higher pleasure. Now, if you asked anybody who's done heroin, I doubt that they would agree with that. But that's at least what Mill would say. And so that brings us to the last basic tenet of utilitarianism, and this is what Mill refers to as the viewpoint of a quote, disinterested and benevolent spectator. This is a really important component of utilitarianism, and it's one that I find very common among teenagers. If there's one thing that I want from you all, it's passion. I want you to be passionate about something in your life. I look at individuals who are dispassionate and who don't care about anything, and not only are they the most boring individuals in the world, but at the same time, there's nothing there. There's no humanity to them. There's no personhood to them. I can't stand being in the same room as somebody who just doesn't care about anything. There's no point in talking to them. There's no point in becoming friends with them. And that's why, so a big component, or utilitarianism is a big component of what we would call postmodern ethics. And there were a couple of individuals who, when we were placing ourselves in our ethical schools a couple of individuals who found themselves in the postmodern ethics school. And so initially I'm like, oh boy, oh no, there are people in postmodern ethics. And so the question that I had them ask, though, is tell me something that you are passionate about and explain it to me in a way that would make me just as passionate about the same topic as you are about that topic. And one of the individuals who was placed into this ethical school, their response about the thing that they were passionate about was super long-winded, and I could tell that as they were writing their response, they were clearly very passionate about what that thing was. And it gave me solace because I realized, okay, this person is not dead in the brain. They're passionate about something, and that's always a good thing. It gives me a lot of hope, and it makes me realize that there's goodness deep down there. But I'm going to flip the tables here and say utilitarianism requires you not to be passionate. If you're passionate, you're doing utilitarianism wrong. And this is what the disinterested and benevolent spectator is. So a proper utilitarian would not only want the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Again, that's a very common sentiment that utilitarians will say. They would want the greatest amount of the highest pleasures for the greatest amount of people. So again, they don't want to just hand out heroin to everybody and so we can all be high and happy. They want everybody to be living a pleasurably virtuous life, or at least they want us to be pursuing pleasure through virtue, and they want everybody to be doing that. It's not possible, but they're at least going to try. That's the good mode of thinking for a utilitarian. So with that in mind, Mill is going to say, well, clearly that makes utilitarianism, or at least it paints utilitarianism as inherently selfless. And this is what I notice a lot in young people and teenagers. They either are selfless individuals, or they want to be selfless individuals, or they want to be, they want to portray themselves as selfless. They want other people to see themselves as selfless. They want to appear to be selfless. And utilitarianism seems to be the best method to get that message across. Well, I want the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So if that means I'm in the minority, sacrifice my own goods and give it to the majority. So here, what Mill is saying is that you have to separate yourself and your position from the situation. You can't be biased in your answers. So oftentimes, I'm debating whether I should include this. I hope by now you're familiar with the trolley problem. If you're not familiar with the trolley problem or the trolley question, look that up on Google. I'm not going to spend time reiterating it because you all should be familiar with it now. It's a common thing. I never talk about it in my class, but I'm sure you've heard about it. What that does is it tests your utilitarian mindset. And usually you have to have a selfless mindset in order to get to your answer, or at least you want people to see your answer as selfless. But imagine your mom or one of your parents was on the tracks, and the other track was 50 strangers. Now it's 50 individuals versus one individual. That one individual just happens to be your mom. Mill is saying a pure utilitarian, a clear utilitarian would sacrifice their mom for the 50 people. That's tough. That's really tough. And this is where utilitarianism a lot of people like to consider themselves utilitarians until it gets to that point, because we do like to have our biases influence our decision. The good thing here is that it is selfless. It is, you're at least morally consistent. But the bad thing is, like I mentioned before, it takes all passion out of the window. Being biased is not a good thing, but the good thing about being biased is that you're at least passionate about something. And I think passion is a necessary component of humanity. So in order to be a proper utilitarian, you have to be unbiased and you have to get rid of all of your passions, essentially. So you have to act in a situation like a spectator. You're watching the situation. You're not participating in the situation. You have to be impartial, like a judge. You can't have a team that you're rooting for and a team that you're rooting against. You have to disconnect yourself from the situation. And you can't care about the outcome. The only thing you care about is how many people are led to pleasure, how many of people are led to the good. And if it's a majority, you did the good thing. If it's the minority, something went wrong. Now, when I look at Mill's tenets of utilitarianism, I very much disagree with them, but I at least think that he's consistent. He's not wrong about anything. Everything that he says lines up. I just don't think it's a good way to live a life. He does. And so in that sense, he's not being inconsistent. He's not being irrational. He's being totally rational. But I have to give him that. My big issue with utilitarianism is probably not with Mill's idea of utilitarianism. It's not necessarily these three basic tenets. It's the fact that modern utilitarianism has shifted a little, or at least it's mutated in a way. So utilitarianism today, it still holds the basic tenet of utility, that first one, but those who have adopted it, those who claim to be utilitarian, and that's their ethical framework, well, they make all of those decisions based on their own definitions of happiness. They're not using Mill's definition of happiness, which is maximized pleasure, minimized pain. And that's where utilitarianism and relativism start to meet, and it starts to morph into this very confusing, irrational thing. If you're going to claim to be a utilitarian, you need to be aware that everybody has to be on the same page on happiness, at least, because utilitarianism is based in happiness. And if you have a disagreement on what happiness means or what happiness is, consent's out the window and goodness is out the window. And things get a lot more tricky, which is why you want to separate utilitarianism from relativism. But again, postmodernism is uniting the two, which is really, in my opinion, really scary. But I want to before we leave utilitarianism for now, I want to compare it to its complete opposite, and that's Kantianism. These two are directly at odds with each other. So remember, Kant teaches specifically, it's the second formula of the categorical imperative, that another person, another individual, should never be treated as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. They should be the focus, not the tool by which you use for the focus. But utilitarianism teaches that sometimes as individuals, we have to be treated as a means to an end for the sake of the common good. So we go back to that example of the flight in 1971 from Uruguay to Chile that crashed in the Andes, in which these men had to resort to cannibalism. Did they treat their fellow passengers who have died as a means to an end? Absolutely. Did they treat them as an end? Absolutely not. It was a very utilitarian action on their part. So the question is, though, were they justified to do it? Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. On top of that, though, we have to consider that there's a difference as well between justification and moral goodness. Was it morally good for them to have done that utilitarian action? Maybe, maybe not. And this is where we get our distinctions. As a deontologist, as somebody who believes that, so what deontology believes is that emphasis should be placed on the action rather than the consequence of a moral act. And that's me. As a deontologist, I would say that those individuals were justified in their action of cannibalizing, but they did not do something that was morally good. And this is where the distinction really sparks up between, a deontologist and a consequentialist or a utilitarian. Utilitarians would say that the morality of the action is dependent on the consequence. The consequence was good, and therefore it was morally good for them to cannibalize. So we are done here with, 4 ethical systems. We've done relativism. We've done Aristotelianism. We've done Kantianism. And now we are done with utilitarianism. These are 4 systems that we call secular ethical systems. Secular ethical systems. They don't relate to religion or faith. And so with this in mind, moving forward, now that we're done with these 4 base secular ethical systems, we can start moving into applied ethics. We're done with this formative ethics, and now we can start getting into, okay, what actions are good and what actions are bad. But it's important for us to know these 4 basic fundamental ethical systems in order to give a clear understanding at what follows. So moving forward, I want you to look at the past 4 schools: relativism, Kantianism, Aristotelianism, and utilitarianism. Find one that you think you most agree with. Maybe my explanation did more for you and you no longer, it's not the same as the one that you were placed in. It's not the same school that you were placed in. Maybe you've changed, or maybe, maybe the quiz that you took just didn't give you a very good or an accurate idea of where you stand ethically. Chances are your ethical beliefs, your beliefs about morality, fall within those 4 different systems. Take that with you as we move into our next note sheet, in which we move into applied ethics. But still remember those 4 systems together. Those make up pretty much the entirety of our understandings of ethics. And it's really going to help us as we move into this very specific applied ethics.